Welcome to another episode of the Trust Builder podcast. Today, I get to have my long-term friend and sales coach, I would say, almost, because you were my first sales coach, Brian Moseley, with me today. Welcome to the show, Brian.
Thanks for having me, Hannah.
Brian, the first time we met was, I would say, 2013. You were working at HubSpot. I was just actually, you made me a HubSpot partner. And so I want to get to that in a second. But since then, you had a long career of different sales positions. You worked after HubSpot, I believe, for SEMrush was your latest data box, Amazon. I mean, you worked at some large companies, and you have a wealth of sales experience. But recently, you made your passion project sort of your full-time job. Right now, you're with SailTime, which is a fractional, I hope I get this right, like a sailing franchise out of New England. And I love your tagline, your boat is ready when you are. So tell us more about your journey and where you're at right now.
Well, you nailed it, and that's a big part of empathy is starting by doing your research and being able to articulate someone else's background to a T. So you nailed that. Yeah, I got my start at HubSpot. I was there for almost 5 years as a sales rep and a sales manager. Then I went to a small startup called DataBox with one of my mentors, Pete Caputa, and I sort of qualify that time as the 0 to 1 experience, taking something that didn't really exist, being the first salesperson in there and growing it to cash flow break even. And then after that, I got a lot of enterprise experience working at AWS, the big player in the cloud space, and got to work with large Fortune 100 type companies. And then I got to take sort of all of that and put it into practice at SEMrush, where I both had to do the 0 to 1 startup launching an enterprise platform. SEMrush primarily operates the core product with a lot of SMB and mid-market type companies. And then a guy named Marcus Tober, a really brilliant, I hesitate to use the word genius, but he came in and sort of built this large enterprise platform. And then after about 10 or 11 years or a decade in working in marketing technology, I sort of took a step back and looked at my life and my career. And I had been doing nights and weekends at a small fractional boat franchise, like you mentioned. And the other people I was working with had grown that company in those last 4 or 5 years to a scale that it was too much to handle, or there was too much to do for just two people. And so timing was just kind of right. I'd felt like I had accomplished what I'd want to in software. Not saying that I won't go back, because I really enjoy a lot of things about it. But I'd always had this itch ever since working with marketing agencies like yourself at HubSpot. I always felt like a little bit of an imposter. I felt like I was giving advice to small business owners who were struggling with payroll, or struggling with sales, or struggling with hiring, or struggling with leading or managing. And I was giving this advice that I trusted was good advice because I'd seen it work. But I always felt like a little bit of an imposter because I had never been in that seat before. So I always knew I wanted to run a small business at some point in my career, but I didn't want to run a marketing agency. I didn't want to run an e-com business or a coffee shop or a trampoline park. I couldn't figure out what I wanted to do. So I've been starting and growing my sailing career over the last 10 years in Boston. And this opportunity came to do it full time. And so I decided to take it. So as of May 1st last year, I jumped in with both feet, and that's my only source of income right now. So doing it full time and having a blast working with my friends, supporting the sailing community in New England and in the Caribbean in the winter seasons.
Awesome. Yeah, you just came back from the Virgin Islands, you poor thing.
I did.
Let's just rewind back. I remember I did 10 years of corporate and then decided to leave SAP and go into opening up my own marketing agency. And for the first 3 years or so, I was struggling, deer in the headlights. What am I going to do? And I remember you've been such an integral part in my success story as a HubSpot partner, as an agency, but also I would say in now becoming a business coach, because a lot of these lessons that I learned with you really applied throughout the last 10 years. And it's really funny, in preparation of this conversation, I mentioned to you how I want to focus on empathy and respect in like sales conversations or running a business, because those are integral parts of building trust. But you said you don't really remember necessarily focusing on empathy.
Yeah, and I don't, at least back then, I never saw it as my superpower. I thought there were things I was good at, but if you had me write down a list of 10 things, I don't know that empathy would have been one of them. I think that's a good place to kind of start the conversation. I think what harms people early in their sales career, and I'm not the first person to say this, is things that you were taught by your parents. How to like always be really nice, overly nice to people, and try to be really, really friendly. And then that works in relationship type sales roles. But for people that are in more consultative sales roles, we know that sales has changed a lot. And people no longer buy from people that they want to get a steak with or have a beer with. They buy from people that teach them something new about their business or how they do their jobs. That's what the book, the Challenger Sale, taught me, and that really stood out. So, a lot of these colloquialisms of like how to just kind of bend to the customer, and the customer's always right, and don't ever challenge them, those no longer really apply in the modern consultative sales process.
Right. We, as modern buyers, we feel always kind of a sense of distrust, and our BS monitor is always on, always sniffing out. And someone who is just maybe genuinely nice, as you said, like we put them in a friend zone, but we don't really trust them in business relationships because we want an authoritative, almost like a teacher, right? A teacher person. If we think about our best mentor or our best teacher, they have certain characteristics that would be really good if they were transferred into a sales role.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Prospects are extremely skeptical, and if you're walking down the street and someone comes up to you and offers to hold the door for you, and gives you $20 bill out of their wallet and asks to buy you a coffee, you're a little bit skeptical. Okay, what does this person want from me?
yeah. So now, if you talk about having empathy in order to build trust, that almost sounds like the opposite of what we're talking about right now, right? But in my so I shared with you that I'm building this trust builder model and I'm writing this book. And the first layers of this model is that you have to show that you're competent, that you're reliable, and that you have integrity. And the
Hmm.
next layer of that is that you have to be empathetic and you have to be respectful. So, in our sense here in trust building, it's the next step that forms that cognitive trust and forms it into or transforms it into a relationship based emotional trust. Because with empathy, we're showing that we understand the person's needs, that we can put ourselves in their shoes. So if we think about what you just said about being authoritative or being sort of a teacher role and not just a nice friend, how does that translate into empathy in those sales conversations? What does it actually look like?
Yeah, I think there's the micro and the macro. So the micro is simple things that your sales manager will tell you, which is show up on time, beat your prospect to the meeting. If I think there was early in my sales career where I've always felt like I was running late, and I'm a very punctual person, but I would jump on Zoom calls 4 or 5 minutes after the hour, and my prospect would just been sitting there tapping their fingers. And that's a really bad way to start a call. So one of the things that I did was I bought a little silly little egg timer, and I kept it by my desk. And instead of thinking about a 60-minute call, I knew I only had 50 minutes because I knew I wasn't good enough to get off the call right at 60 minutes. We'd be right in the mix of a great conversation, and I have to cut it off. And I was 5 minutes. I ended that conversation poorly, and then I would jump to my next conversation poorly. So with the 50-minute call, I was very disciplined. So I'd start winding the call down at the 42 or 43-minute mark. I would get off that call politely with plenty of time. I'd spend 5 minutes recapping that call. I'd spend another 5 minutes getting in the mindset for my next call, and I would join on the hour. And that really, really helped. And again, it sounds really silly, but it's something I buy software today in my business, and there are a lot of sales reps that still are early in their careers and can't really figure out how to get on a call before their prospect. So that's kind of a very simple micro version.
If I
And then
can
there,
jump if I can jump in here real quick
please.
before you go to the macro version, because that is something that is still so prominent in my day to day. What I learned from you is if the prospect doesn't show up in 5 minutes, you actually taught me to write them a quick email to say, "Hey, is everything okay?"
Yeah, yeah.
Because you don't want to be like the one who's nice checking in, but sort of having an expectation. Well, the two of us had a meeting, and there's a nice fine art about how to approach that. Right?
There is, and the is everything okay is a totally appropriate response. Another one I like is, and I give people the benefit of the doubt. I always do. People are busy. They have their kids. They're walking their dog. They're going to get a pack. They're working from home. They're going to get an Amazon package at their front door. Like, I get it. But after 7, 8 minutes now, I will send an email and say, hey, I'm going to be on the call for until 9, 10. Until 10 minutes after the hour. And then I'm going to move on to other things. Let me know if this time still works for you. And I think some people might do that more aggressively, and maybe I did earlier in my career. But yeah, I think it's a soft way to just say, hey, look, my time is just as valuable as your time, Mr. and Mrs. Prospect. And if this time doesn't work, like, that's fine. But I'm not just going to sit here for 20 minutes and twiddle my thumbs. So yeah, that's a great point. I had forgotten about that.
All right, now you were going to jump into your macro.
Sure. And so the macro version of that is always, empathy. It sounds like sort of this fluffy, sort of emotional word when you think about it in the context of your friends and your family. If your friend had something terrible happen to them and their boat sank, or they're going through a tough time with their parents' health or something like that. Empathy is like sitting on the couch and putting your hand on their shoulder and listening and giving them a shoulder to kind of cry on. That's what I think of. But I don't think of it that way in the sales process. A salesperson is can sometimes be a therapist, but that's not their primary role. What I think empathy is it's taking your agenda, which is selling a deal. Like, let's be honest, that's what that's what we came here to do. That's what we're compensated to do. It's to sell a deal. It's taking that agenda and putting it aside and focusing on whatever the prospect's agenda is. And this is very important, wherever the prospect is in their journey. Another huge mistake I see a lot of salespeople make is they start at the beginning of their sales process, regardless of where the prospect is. I was evaluating some software recently to help us manage service tickets for our fleet. And I get on a call and there was a sales engineer there, and they did a very decent discovery call. And I was prepared for some sort of demo. I already told them that there was like 2 features I was interested in, like 2 features. And they built rapport. They did everything right. They showed up on time, but they started at the beginning and they just started walking me through their software. And it just felt very canned and very templatized. And so oftentimes I would get on calls and it's usually happened with people that were very busy or very stern or very direct. Is I'd say like they'd seem very like hurried, and they were very like, they'd seem very like frustrated. They're like, I've been on 6 demos today. I don't want to sit here and go through the login screen and what languages you offer and whether or not this landing page is mobile responsive or not. They're like, I want to see this and this. And so having empathy for where your prospect is in their day and how busy they are is taking your planned agenda, your planned demo, and maybe you spend an hour prepping for this call, but maybe somebody comes on the call and they just want to see 2 things. It's taking your whole plan, putting it aside and saying, got it. Let me show you this. Let me show you this. And whenever a prospect was very like pushy, I would sort of throw my script away. I mean, I don't really use a script, but throw your plan away and say, here's all the tools. You tell me what you want to see. And that disarms them. It puts them in control, and it gets them their cortisol, their stress chemical in their brains kind of goes down, and they're like, okay, this person's not going to waste my time, because that's what busy people hate. They hate feeling like their time is being wasted. So taking your agenda, putting it aside, focusing on the prospect's agenda, and meeting them where they are in the sales process, because as we all know, no one's evaluating your software from scratch anymore. People do. Geez, I don't know. The number used to be like 70% 10 years ago. Now people are starting to engage sales at like 80, 90, 95% of the way through the sales process. So you got to understand that as a salesperson and say, look, I'm sure you've already researched our trust reviews on Trust Radius. I'm sure you've already talked to 4 other people that are customers. I'm sure you've already looked at our pricing page. I'm sure you're at the very end of this thing and you're deciding between us and somebody else. What do you want to know? What can I help you with today? And just teasing that out of them, that's going to give them it's going to help them make a decision much faster, which is essentially what we all want in sales, is to shorten that sales cycle.
Right, nothing kills sales better than time, right? Like you need to keep that momentum. And actually, how you're describing it, it just ties perfectly back what you said in the beginning with being that consultative, authoritative person. If you can put that aside, you're showing, I'll just counsel you or I give you advice on what you really need. It shows also that you're very confident in the thing that you're selling. Now, my biggest concern when I talk to people about empathy is it's something that you can quite easily, not for a long time, but initially, quite easily fake, right? If someone shares a problem with me and I can train someone, like a salesperson, to sit with that a bit and be like, oh, that must be hard. And my concern is always that people will use it in a manipulative way.
Mm.
But have you ever experienced that? And what sort of I almost don't want to lead you on to say, look, guys, it's not going to work. Don't do it. But what's the problem with that if I use it in a manipulative way?
Oh, it's a really great question. I mean, the obvious answer, you're gonna lose your prospect. You're gonna lose sort of it sounds so cliche, but you're going to lose trust with them, obviously. I think to a role I had working for a marketing agency where the sale was much more relationship, and a lot of the thing I sold was very much a commodity. And so when you sell a commodity, people do need to buy from you because they like you, because they can get your product anywhere. I have a good friend of mine, Sam, who sells polypropylene resin, which is used in plastics. And there are 10 different companies that sell it. And these buyers call him up and they ask for a certain price. And either he can get different rail cars of this propylene resin pellets for that price, or he can't. And so in his business, he's always flying around the country and he takes people to Boston Red Sox games and to hockey games and to steak dinners. And people do buy from him because they like him. And he's very honest with these people, and they're his friends. I was at his wedding over the summer in Colorado, and there were his boss and 3 of his customers were at my table at his wedding. They become part of his sort of like inner circle. And you can maybe fake empathy and for the first couple meetings, but over the long term, people are going to kind of find you out. And Sam doesn't mind telling people he can't do things for a certain price. He doesn't mind saying, nope, I'm not going to do that, or I'm not going to put my team to try to get this for you as a rush order, because he's thinking about the long term. Now, in a consultative sale, it's a little bit different. I think you're just going to get found out at a certain point. I think it's focusing on the wrong thing, like making somebody feel comfortable telling you where their problems are is sort of my logical reason for building rapport and building trust early in the sales process. I don't think of it as like, oh, I need to show a lot of empathy early on so that this person will like me. And there's actually a whole set of qualities that hurt a salesperson's abilities. They're called these like sales weaknesses. There's a great blog post about this. And one of them, which I had early in my career, was this need for approval. I think a lot of salespeople start their careers and they start with nothing. They start with a laptop and an email account and a list in Salesforce. And they're told like, hey, go sell. And when you lack experience and product knowledge, you try to make up for it in being overly sort of nice and empathetic and being somebody that other people want to hang out with. But I think I think the thing that you need to do at that stage is build your confidence through experience. So really diving in and learning everything about your space, learn about your competitors, like become that industry expert is the only way to get past that need for approval. And once you shed your need for approval skin, you can then focus on doing things like, I used to share something personal about myself on calls, and I used to share my personal goals on calls first. I sort of like was a little bit vulnerable and put myself out there, and I would share my personal struggles, my personal challenges, and my personal goals with prospects that I didn't even know, with perfect strangers, because that would enable them to feel more comfortable sharing their personal goals and challenges with me. Because what you really need in sales is, what you're really selling is not your product or your service or yourself. You're really first selling your prospect against inaction. The
Yeah.
thing that kills all deals is prospects just not doing anything, not buying your product or not buying another person's product. It's usually just them not doing anything. And so, in order to get them over the hump, to convince themselves, you can't convince them. They can only convince themselves. To convince themselves that they need to do something different, you have to be able to get them to articulate there is a deep, a deep stressful pain that they cannot go another day, enduring that pain, and that you have to tie some real consequences to inaction. And so, in order to, that's deep. Like, that's, you're really, diving into this person's day to day. And if their pain point that they come to you with is like, my email deliverability rates are low, you're not going to sell that deal. That is not a compelling enough reason to switch from your current provider. You have to get them to say that their email deliverability is low, therefore their last review with their boss was poor, they're on a performance plan, their company's losing money, they cut 10 different jobs. Excuse me. You have to get them to say like where it hurts and how much. And the only way to do that is to, in the beginning, while you're building rapport and doing your discovery call, to show a ton of empathy and get them to feel really comfortable telling you what's going wrong in their lives. And that's a very difficult skill, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah. So one thing, or let's say another thing I learned from you, was that I shouldn't imagine myself across the table from someone, but actually sitting next to them, right? That's where, for me, a lot of that empathy that you gave me or that you were showing in sales conversations is expressing itself. And since then, I have that mindset of sitting next to the person. But another thing you told me while you were explaining that concept back then was, you said, don't just try to sell, try to help. Because I kept on saying, I'm an introvert, I have imposter syndrome, I can't sell, I'm so scared of all these things. And you're like, yeah, but just imagine yourself helping them. Mind blown, completely changed the rest of the trajectory of who I am as a person, right? Because now I'm sitting next to them, I'm asking questions without an agenda. I'm really genuinely exploring. I'm genuinely digging deeper. And you were just alluding to that. It's not like that surface level questions. Dig 3 layers deep, like law of three, right? Just peel the onion. Try to get to the root cause of the thing. And if you have that mindset of, I'm trying to help here, and I'm genuinely asking questions for them to discover what the actual problem is, that's showing empathy right now. That's genuinely, you can't fake that. You have to have sort of that mindset. Any other techniques or habits that you have that get you into that empathetic mindset?
Yeah, I think a great example of what you just talked about is, I had a friend recently come over to my house, and we'd been talking about different builds. He's building a house in Maine, and he came over and he put 3 different layouts of this house him and his family were building in Maine. And he was asking my advice. And I was looking at layout 1, layout 2, layout 3. And it reminded me of what you just said about sitting on the same side of the table. And so the analogy is, in order to do that, you have to really, again, take your agenda of selling your product and kind of put it aside, which is really hard for people to do. It sounds so paradoxical and counterintuitive, like, well, I'm not going to talk about my competitors. And I think there's a lot of old school sales managers that still might say, like, do not talk about your competitors. I'm personally very comfortable talking about my competitors because it's the only way that I can build the trust that I need. So in that example, What I would often do is I'd say, look, you can choose between there's a bunch of great email software systems out there. Obviously, there's HubSpot, there's Pardot, and Marketo. Here's what I really like about Pardot. Their Salesforce connector is better than ours. Here's what I like about Marketo. Um, they have a lot of large enterprise customers that we don't have. And this was back in 2014, and all these things were true. I'd say, and we're HubSpot, and here's what we're the best, like all in one play. And then I would just go on mute and just let that sit out there. And when a prospect hears you talking positively about your competitors, all their guard goes down. And they're like, oh, this person's not trying to sell me. They're being completely different than the pushy car salesman I was used to dealing with 10 years ago. This is kind of weird. I feel like I'm talking to a software consultant now, and now I can come a little closer to the middle. I can meet this person. I can tell them a little bit more about my business because, man, they're an expert. I didn't know that each of these softwares had this core competency or this superpower. I wonder what else they can teach me about this. And then, the next question is like, well, what are the cons of all these products? And I'll say, well, Marketo is typically the most expensive. Pardot has, is complicated to use, and HubSpot. And I don't even remember anymore what I used against HubSpot, but I used something. And then when you can, you're not slamming your own product or you're not slamming your competitors, but when you're being objective, that's what gets people to trust you more. And so be prepared for that conversation. Don't be afraid to talk about your competencies, and don't be afraid to talk about your downsides. And hopefully you work for a company that you really do love the product. I think if you don't love the product or love the company that you're at, you're going to have a really hard time with this in general, because it's going to be tough to get people to trust you. Like step one, really love and trust the company and the company that you work for and the services that you sell and the products that you sell. And then step two, really understand your competition and do not shy away from, talking about your inefficiencies, and don't shy away from talking about your competitor's strengths. That's the only way to get on the same side of the table as your prospect, because that's what a consultant would do. That's what an objective third party would do. They don't have a dog in the fight. They simply want to help. They're simply motivated to help their client make the best purchasing decision. And that's the exact right mindset to be in as a salesperson.
Yeah. So now to someone listening, they might think, well, this is all great. I get your point. Empathy, I get it. But how do you balance having empathy to actually, as you said before, you're getting paid to sell. Ultimately, we're not a charity. We are here to make money. How do you balance having empathy to meeting your sales quota?
I think early in my career, I realized that success begets success. And one of the reasons that top performers stay at the top is because they're not afraid to walk away from deals. So I think sales, when you're not at your quota, and I've been at both. I've been the number one sales rep, and I've been, I've been on one of the last on my team in any given month. So I know how it feels, and I can tell you, I sell much differently when I'm at the top than when I'm at the bottom. And what that means is, when you're at the bottom, you're chasing deals. And these empathy that you have, this trust that that you really spend a lot of time cultivating, trying to build. You're very when you're at the top, you're very careful with it. It's very delicate. It's like you're building an origami swan or something like that. And you have to be like patient, and you feel like you have all the time in the world, and you're very relaxed, and you're like in the Zen state where you're building this intricate, swan. But when you're at the bottom, everything's rushed, and it's like you have a light shining on you and a timer above your head, and you kind of fold really, really quickly, and you get a crummy origami swan. The best thing to do, and it sounds silly, but it's like, focus on your top of the funnel and focus on prospecting, because then you'll always have enough deals and opportunities to be able to let some of them go. When you start to get hungry, you start to chase, and when you chase, you start to take shortcuts, and that really affects the empathy and the trust building in the sale. So the standard advice, and again, it sounds kind of silly and simple and basic, But the more you can do to focus on your prospecting and keeping disciplined around prospecting, whether in good times or in bad times, that will enable you to have enough abundance of opportunities that you're not going to go chasing a bad deal and wasting your time trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. There was this actually reminds me of a silly YouTube clip I saw recently where there was this boxer, and he had just won this title, and it was like his third title, and he was this up and comer, and the person that was interviewing him was really excited and wanted this like big emotional reaction, like, how does it feel to be on top? And he sat there and said, it feels really good. And she's sort of stunned, says, wow, I thought you'd be more excited. He said, well, when I lose, I try not to get too down on myself. And so when I win, I also try not to get too high on myself. I just try to go back to the gym and work hard and prepare for my next match. And I thought that was really neat. I think sometimes when you see, I watch a lot of ice hockey, when you see ice hockey players score goals, they react differently. Some of them like throw their hands up in the air and smile and hug their teammates and sort of like almost jump up and down with joy and adulation. That's what I would do. And then other players are a lot more stoic and they don't really smile and you don't really see that reaction from them. Check it out. Notice it. Next time if you're watching sports or something, watch how people celebrate. I think it tells you a lot about their character. And so I think in sales, to tie the sporting analogy back, is I think whether you're winning or losing, you really should try your best to keep an even keel and stay sort of as moderate as you can in your mindset, and know that it's a marathon, it's not a sprint, and you're going to have wins and you're going to have losses, good months and bad months, good days and bad days, and it's sort of just analogous for life, really.
That's a great analogy. I mean, I'm more a soccer person myself, but I love when some players just, they score this phenomenal goal and they just, okay, next, right? They just move
Go
on
line
and others
up. Yeah.
throw themselves on the floor and they,
Take their
yeah,
jersey off.
yeah. Well, that's not allowed anymore. So just to finish us off here, what advice would you give a sales professional to prioritize empathy? If they say, okay, I hear you, I get it, I'm not a naturally empathetic person myself, is there one or two small things that they could start implementing today that could really help them on becoming more empathetic?
I'm going to admit something that I'm a little embarrassed about, but when I first started to learn what active listening was, and maybe it sounds shocking to people, but I was 28 before I really understood what active listening was, and I had to be taught it. It wasn't something I learned in high school or college, or and looking back, it's like, man, how did I operate with friendships and with families without being good at this skill set? No one really teaches you this, and I think some people it comes very naturally to them. Some people, you for example, I think you're a very naturally empathetic person. I was not. I had to literally be taught, but you can be taught. It's a skill set like driving a car or anything else. And so I'll never forget. I took my first sort of active listening class at HubSpot, and they were teaching this topic, and they spent a whole session on it. And I remember I called my mom. I didn't tell her, but I just asked her how her day was, and I sort of had to really do something I'd never done before, which is like really listen to what she was saying and try to articulate it back to her in a way that didn't sound like a robot and didn't sound repetitive. I didn't use the same words. I sort of told the story in more of a summary. And then I started doing that with all my personal conversations. I started making a mental note before that conversation that I was going to practice. You can't get good at something unless you kind of practice it. And I heard something from, I think it was like either Jerry Seinfeld or Ray Romano, one of those comics that has clean sets where they don't swear. They said that they had to stop swearing in their personal life in order to stop swearing on stage. And I think you have to practice these things in your personal life in order to get good at them at work. And so when I would go on dates, I would even do this earlier in my life, and I would listen to what the person next to me was saying, and I would make a mental note to really try to unpack it in my brain, pay attention to it, and then sort of repeat it back to them throughout the course of an hour-long type conversation. Maybe it sounds silly, and it wasn't disingenuous at all. I was truly interested because I'm a very curious person. I was truly interested in what my mom was saying, telling me about her doctor's appointment and her pickleball lesson and all these different things. But I was always doing something else when I was talking to her. I'd be walking around my condo, or I'd be thinking about 10 other things that I had to do that day. And it wasn't until I made a specific choice and I was more deliberate about those different conversations with friends and family that I started to gain the practice that I could use those same skills on calls with prospects where it didn't sound forced and it was truly genuine.
Yeah. One other thing, and I'm sorry I keep on going, one other thing I learned from you, but it's true. As you're talking about active listening, the other thing that you always kept mentioning that goes hand in hand is never to make assumptions.
Mm.
Never come into a conversation just assuming something, but ask the person and have them verify it, or just be genuinely curious. But it comes back to what you said before, putting something aside. That's always something I stress with the sales teams that I coach to now say, don't make assumptions. Like, don't come in and say, oh, they have read this thing, or they have done this thing, or they know this, whatever it is.
I have a great example of that. Is you're totally right. I think this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where like the things that you learn in elementary school of like how to be nice to people and how to talk to people. Really, on the American side, it's much different than the European side, right? So like when you're walking down or when you talk to a business colleague and they say, "Hey, how's your day?" What do we say in America to that? I'm like, "Hey, Hannah, how's your day?" What do we say?
Great. How about you?
Good. It's great. It's good. How about you? It's great. Oftentimes, sometimes in Europe, people aren't as friendly. You know, they can be a little more direct. And I remember once I was on a call with a prospect with a woman, and I was like, how's your day? As we were starting a call, and she's like, it's great. I was like, oh, because it didn't sound great. You know, she said great, but it didn't sound great. And I said, oh, what's great about it? It doesn't sound great. Like, what was great about it? And she like paused and she kind of broke down and she was like, it's not great. Like, my dog is sick and my boss yelled at me and like we're really down on our goals this month, and going back to what you said, like not making assumptions. Don't make assumptions about how people are doing, and even if they tell you one thing, you know, be skeptical, sort of dig in. That's a very sort of silly high level example, but never make assumptions about like how people feeling, or whether they read the content that you sent them, and don't be afraid to kind of dig in a little bit and kind of get to the root of it.
Awesome. Now, you already mentioned The Challenger Sale as a book that changed your outlook on sales. What is another book that you read in the last 6 to 12 months that has changed your life?
I read a book on this sailing trip by an author named Lori Gottlieb. She wrote another book called Marry Him, The Art of Settling, which is like actually the title's a little deceiving. It's much deeper about like how people choose their partners. I really like her writing style. And so I read this book on this sailing trip called You Should Talk to Someone, which, yeah, it's not a business book. It's about her experience as she's like a writer and for out in Los Angeles, and she was a producer. And then she eventually went to med school, but didn't become a doctor, and then became a therapist and then an author. So she's this really impressive person who sort of got notoriety much later in her life and her career, but she does a great job of storytelling. And the book starts out with her kind of going through this really intense breakup with this person that she thought she was going to marry. And she uses that to sort of weave this narrative and of like her journey when dealing with really difficult things. So it sounds sort of depressing, but it's actually a fun read. And she's a really interesting person. And I would recommend that book.
Awesome. Thank you for that recommendation. So now if someone wants to get in touch, how would they go about doing that? I mean, whether it's to try out sailing
Sure.
or maybe they have a sales question. I don't know if you're open to that. But as a follow-up to this conversation, how would they be in touch?
Yeah, well, I think they do what you did, which is you sent me a really nice Loom video. It was like 60 seconds. It told me the background of the podcast and what you were hoping to get out of it. And you did some. I mean, we've known each other obviously, but if we didn't, you know, you kind of had my LinkedIn pulled up, and you talked about a recent post that I made. So I think that's definitely the best way to get in touch. But yeah, I mean, just LinkedIn. I'm on Instagram, BMOS14. I'm on Twitter. And then you can go to sailtime.com and learn more about getting started sailing in New England, or taking winter charters in the Caribbean.
Well, I can't thank you enough. I am genuinely thrilled to have you on this episode, and I learned so much. We didn't really get to the respect part of the side of the story, but so many insights here. Truly appreciate it.
Yeah, the respect thing. Let's cover that in one sentence. Like, just don't be a jerk.
I love that. That's a great finish line. Thank you so much, Brian, for coming on.
Thanks for having me.